Hello and welcome. This is the lecture for Unit 1, which is about medical anthropology as a field of inquiry. So what I'm really hoping to do in this lecture is to help you understand what medical anthropology is in the first place, and to talk about some of the key concepts and tools that medical anthropologists use that you will then be able to apply moving forward across this semester. I want to start by locating medical anthropology within the field of anthropology. I know for some of you this will be your first anthropology course. For others of you it will not. But wherever you are in your relationship to the field, I want to clarify, give you sort of a map of the components of anthropology that this particular course will deal with. So anthropology as an academic discipline is quite broad, and indeed it includes 4 subfields or branches. Those are cultural anthropology, biological anthropology, archaeology, and linguistic anthropology. This course, this medical anthropology course, is located entirely in the subfield of cultural anthropology. Okay, that's the one I've got there in red. So of those 4 subfields, this is a cultural anthropology course. And then we're being more specific than that even in zeroing in on one sort of cultural anthropology, which is medical anthropology. And medical anthropologists study the cultural context of health, illness, and healing. There are indeed medical anthropologists working in biological anthropology, or who take a sort of combined approach and draw on some elements of cultural anthropology and some elements of biological anthropology. In this course, we are grounded entirely in the field of cultural anthropology. So we will be looking at sociocultural phenomena that are relevant to issues of health, illness, and healing. Okay. I wanted to point out also that this is an LEX class, and what that means is that we will engage in a particular sort of engaged learning practice, which is research. So for this course, you do not need to have a background in anthropology, and we will sort of be bringing you up to speed on the anthropology aspects, and one of the ways that we'll encourage all of you in the course to really to learn how anthropologists do what they do is to participate in some small-scale research practices yourself. So we will work on those across the semester, but that's just to suggest that these are some of the fundamental things to know about how this course is oriented. Okay, so let's dig into some of the key theoretical tools in medical anthropology that, again, I think will help you understand the nature of this field, and that will also be relevant ways to make use of anthropology moving forward. So I'm going to draw from the initial readings that you did in this first couple of weeks of the course to talk about things I think it's important to know about how medical anthropologists approach their work. We're going to start with the article by Shepherd, Hughes, and Locke, which was called The Three Bodies. And you may have noticed that this is an article that was published some time ago in the late 1980s. And purposefully, in these initial readings that I have you doing, I'm going a little bit back in time to try to give you a sense of the fundamentals of the field and also how it's sort of progressed or evolved over time. So you may have noticed that this earlier piece from the 1980s is accompanied by several other pieces that are increasingly closer to the current era. So a lot of what Shepherd, Hughes, and Locke are talking about are some really just important main ideas in medical anthropology that have been part of the field for some time. So this is the reason to sort of go back a little bit historically in terms of the publication. So the premise of Shepherd, Hughes, and Locke's article is that the body is both a physical and a symbolic artifact. It's both naturally and culturally produced. So immediately, one of the things we're going to start thinking about is how medical anthropology is different than other sorts of medical fields, okay? So this is thinking about health, illness, and healing as both grounded in the physical biological body, but also as culturally mediated. So what are those three bodies then that they talk about in this article? The first is what they call the individual body, and this is how one experiences their own personhood. It's often in the Western context the notion of a body self, right? In other words, a discrete, separate body that is the primary location of how you understand yourself to be. So we will talk in a few moments about the fact that that Western body self concept is just one model of what the individual body is and its significance. But this is certainly one of the bodies, the individual body. The second is what they call the social body. And for this component of their model, what they're talking about here is the ways in which the physical individual body and the social body are intertwined. Okay, so in other words, how you experience the world at the level of your individual body is not separate from the society of which you are a part. And indeed, that often, even just in the way we talk, we make connections or draw analogies between the two. So, for example, you may hear people talk about a healthy society. Just using that phrase suggests that we're thinking of society as sort of a body writ large. So that parallel is something, again, that Shepherd, Hughes, and Locke would draw our attention to. And the third body they talk about is what they term the body politic. And this references the idea of the fact that the body is also a site of political controls of various sorts, some of which we sort of enact ourselves, right? We, to some degree, sort of police our own bodies around some of the social expectations around us. And in plenty of other ways, your body is policed by external forces. So an example of that sort of self-policing is the ways that many of us take pains to meet gendered expectations around bodily presentation. And that can be in terms of the size and shape of the body, the way the body is adorned, even up to things like body language. So the body politic, then, is Shepherd, Hughes, and Locke's way of talking about how political power and control are enacted on and through the body. Okay, so let's break down each of these in turn. And I do want to, as we talk about them, to also bring in some examples that will allow us to think a little bit more broadly and cross-culturally. This is a cultural anthropology course, of course, and anthropologists are interested in thinking about the variability and the relativity of any sort of social phenomenon, right? So the sort of version of the individual body that may feel the most familiar is not the only one. So again, as anthropologists, we want to think about how these things are done and understood and conceptualized in a variety of cultural contexts. So the individual body refers to the experienced individual body self. For many people in the U.S. And grounded in a Western cultural framework, this would refer to a sort of individualized, individuated entity that is both a physical body, which is considered to be a sort of a shell or a site for the presence of yourself or mind. René Descartes, the philosopher, is often the reference for this particular model. The idea of mind-body dualism, this is his diagram here, is that the mind is the primary site of your personhood. Your body is the vehicle for your thinking mind, and that is really what constitutes yourself. Now, that is not, as I've suggested, the only way to conceptualize what an individual body or an individual person is. So as another example, as a contrasting example, I'll give you this example on the bottom. And this is drawing from the work of a medical anthropologist named Marina Roseman, who has done long-term field research in Malaysia with a group of people called Temiar. And what Dr. Roseman found, or has found in her work, is that Temiar people have a very different conceptualization of what an individual person is and what the relationship between body and self is. So contrary to the model, the sort of mind-body model on the top, the Temiar conceptualization of a person is as permeable. That is, that the person is composed of multiple detachable selves. And Roseman describes these selves, which take the form of spirits. So each person includes a head spirit, a heart spirit, an odor spirit, and a shadow spirit. And what she describes is that these spirits can, and sometimes do, wander off into the forest around where Temiar people live, and essentially detach themselves from the person, which brings on various kinds of illness. That these spirits can be distracted, or they will interact with various things they encounter in the forest and sort of leave the person behind. When that occurs, then healing practices are important. The image on the bottom here is of such a healing practice, where the healer who is standing is calling back that spirit to the person from whom it has departed. So what this suggests then is not only something about how Temiar people conceptualize what illness and health and healing are, but also how they conceptualize the person as being composed of multiple components that can be disaggregated at times. So the person in Temiar conceptualization is not the integrated whole that mind-body dualism or the Descartes model would suggest. So again, these are not the only two models, but these are two to get us thinking about this notion that an individual body is important in all cultural contexts, but it may be understood in differing ways. Now, another theoretical tool that's useful here and that is often used by medical anthropologists to think about the individual body is an approach called phenomenology, which derives from philosophy. So anthropologists draw their theoretical tools from a variety of adjacent fields, including philosophy. And the notion with phenomenology is that it emphasizes the way one lives in and experiences the world. Right? So it is focused on embodiment and the way it feels to live in and through your body, okay, as a sort of starting point for analyzing the nature of existence. When anthropologists use this, such as the anthropologist I list here, Thomas Chortis, they often talk about it in these terms, that the body is the existential ground of culture and self. So this is an approach to studying social events and social phenomena that starts from the lived body. Okay, that's how phenomenology relates to anthropology. The anthropologist, and in particular the medical anthropologist, Chortis works on various issues related to health and healing, is going to start with that embodied experience and build a cultural model out from there. Okay, so again, we'll return to these tools across the semester, but this is another sort of tool for your toolkit that can be applied to thinking about various issues that we'll encounter. So that is the first body, then the individual body. The second body that Shepherd, Hughes, and Locke talk about is what they call the social body. And here they are referencing the fact that bodily and social things are not separate, but are linked. And indeed, they are often explicitly understood as parallel or as analogous in various cultural worlds. Okay, so in that way, the body often is used as a sort of a symbol or as a model for social processes. So the example I'll give you of this is drawing from the work of an anthropologist named Jean Komaroff, who has done long-term research in South Africa. And Komaroff's work is both ethnographic, meaning she spent time, contemporary time with people in this part of South Africa where she worked, where the people are Tswana. And also, Komaroff is also interested in the sort of historical processes. So she also looked into archives and tried to understand the history of Tswana people and their society. So one of the things she found that goes directly to this question of how the bodily and the social are linked, and in a lot of ways are understood as parallel, is what she learned about pre-colonial Tswana settlements, right? In other words, the way that people organized their houses and their neighborhoods, right? How they used space. And she was able to produce this sort of diagram, right? And it's a little hard to read, so I'll show you sort of what she's trying to do here. She's demonstrating how the way that Tswana people organized their houses and communities in space referenced the physical body and helped both delineate sort of broader social roles and the individual roles of particular people vis-a-vis what was understood to be distinctive about bodies. So the house was sort of right here in the center of the diagram. The back of the house is here, leading off into the fields. The front of the house is here, leading into the center of town, so to speak, right, or the center of the village. And what she says is this was understood as sort of a body and also a set of spheres that had to do with things like domestic versus public activities, and male versus female spheres of activity. So the back of the house and the sort of orientation towards the agricultural fields was a female sphere, right? The front of the house and the orientation towards the center of town, so to speak, was a male sphere. And this overall plan was understood as a model of bodies. And indeed, the interface between male and female was often explicitly referred to in terms of reproduction, right? The place where male and female meet in the house and at the hearth were used, again, as a sort of symbolic way of talking about both how bodies operate and how the social body operates, all right? So again, this is just one example, but it's an example of the ways that bodily and social are intersecting in that model of the social body that Shepard, Hughes, and Locke are providing us with. And then the third body that they talk about is what they call body politic. So this is about how bodies act as sites of political regulation and control. And I'm going to give you a couple examples to illustrate this. The first is from a scholar named Susan Bordo, who's not actually an anthropologist. She's an interdisciplinary humanities scholar, but she's written a lot of really interesting things, especially around gender, that have been inspiring also to anthropologists. So one thing that Bordo wrote about gender and illness that's relevant to this idea of the body politic is she wrote a piece where she traces out 3 illnesses as they are grounded in history. And what she argues is that each of these 3 illnesses, which primarily afflicted women, are reflections of exaggerated versions of expectations of femininity in that particular historical era. Okay? So in other words, she's saying, first of all, that these illnesses are far more than just some sort of biological phenomenon. And second, she's saying that the way that these particular illnesses function was as a means of sort of control, particularly of women's bodies, by pathologizing elements of what were understood to be female, distinctive female elements of embodiment and character. Okay. The 3 examples she uses are hysteria, agoraphobia, and anorexia. And the one I'll focus on is agoraphobia, right, which is a fear of leaving your home base, right, fear of leaving your house. And so what she's talking about in this example is that there was a significant increase in agoraphobia among women in the 1950s and 60s. And it coincided, and she would say not coincidentally, with the rise in a cult of domesticity in the U.S. In the post-World War II era, a bunch of different things were going on. There was a certain amount of prosperity that allowed people to, for example, move into suburban spaces. There was an increase in home ownership. There was an increase in nuclear families living separately from their extended families. And there was a shift in ideas about women's roles in the workforce and in the domestic sphere. Previous to that era, lots of women, for example, worked outside of the house. During World War II, lots of women worked in factories. In the 1950s, there was a rise of this sort of cult of domesticity, which was a new idea that women were supposed to be or were destined to be in the home, and that various kinds of domestic duties, cooking, cleaning, child rearing, were, again, sort of fundamental to women's social roles, if not biologically ordained. So what Bordeaux is saying is that it's not a coincidence that in this exact era where women were being heavily expected to be in the home and to do certain kinds of things in the home, there was a rise in this agoraphobia, which is the fear of leaving your home, right? So she's saying it's a sort of exaggerated version of the feminine ideal of the domestic sphere for women, the idealized 1950s housewife, that became a sort of a pathologized version of what that current cultural expectation of women was. All right. So again, this is an example of the body politic, how notions of illness here are connected to regulation and control. I'll give you one other example, which is an example from the work of Michael Kearney about, in particular, the U.S.-Mexico border. This is, again, another example of this body politic. And what Kearney writes about is this sort of increased emphasis on border control, and particularly in controlling the bodies of migrants, and how the sort of fetishizing of the border is both about controlling the movement of individual bodies and shoring up the boundaries of the nation state, and really asserting which bodies can comprise that nation. So this is certainly, Kearney's work is from a couple of decades ago, but this is certainly an ongoingly important, relevant issue. So again, the notion here is that the ways that, for example, both policies and physical walls and the militarization of our southern border are about controlling bodies and the body politic. Now, I'll leave you just with a couple of thought questions because, again, ultimately, these are some theoretical tools that I hope that we'll be able to apply to various examples we encounter in the course, and also that you can apply just to what you experience in your everyday life. So we could easily apply this concept of the three bodies to contemporary United States society. So you might think, for example, in your own lives, what are the bodily practices that are used to define gender and sexuality in contemporary U.S. society? And what are the mechanisms that either encourage or force people to conform, right? It's not an accident that there are patterns in the way that people self-present. How does that happen? So that's something I'd like you to think about. In terms of thinking about the social body, I gave you the example from Komarov's work of how houses and neighborhoods reflected ideas about individual bodies. Is there anything about housing in the U.S. or in Chicago that says something about the social body? That's something to contemplate. And finally, bodily control. And just because we happen to be in the context of higher education, I'll ask you to think about the ways that control and the forces of the body politic are enacted in our educational system, right? And that could be either in terms of when and where people are schooled, or even down to even the sort of physical dispositions that are part of schooling, right? If you need to sit upright in a desk that's, lined up in a row in front of a teacher, then that probably says something too about the body politic. So I'll just leave you with those questions to contemplate as you apply these things you're learning about anthropology to what you experience in your everyday life. Okay. The other article that you read that I think has a lot to offer in terms of key concepts and theories is Locke's article. So yes, it's the same Locke. She's a very important medical anthropologist. So a lot of her work is really foundational to this field. So you'll see her name come up multiple times. In this particular article, what Locke is talking about is what she calls troubling natural categories, by which she means that one of the key things that medical anthropology does is to pull apart some of the things we tend to take for granted about the world and about ourselves as human beings. And to trouble those natural categories, she talks about three key concepts or theoretical approaches that I want to now run through. Medicalization, local biologies, and what she calls the moral economy of scientific knowledge and practice. Medicalization, which is also discussed in the article by Zucker that you read, is a really important concept in medical anthropology and one that will come up multiple times during the course. What medicalization refers to is really a focus on biological pathologies in the body. So that has a couple of sort of aspects to it. The first is a tendency to look to an individual body to understand the source of illness, as opposed to understanding the various social and political forces that contribute to illness or contribute to suffering. So it's, in other words, a sort of decontextualized approach to understanding illness and health. And another component of that is then turning phenomena that are really not medical in nature into diseases that require medical intervention. So it's sort of pathologizing of what can be understood as normal bodily processes. And I want to give you, again, a couple of examples. One is, again, coming from Bordeaux, the scholar that we talked about in the previous slide, who wrote an interesting piece where she talks about medicalization in terms of the illness category called erectile dysfunction, which one of the things that she suggests about is that this is an example of the pathologizing of what are really quote unquote normal or expected processes within male bodies, right? That men in middle age will behave differently in terms of their sexuality than men, for example, in their 20s. And what she suggests is turning ED into a disease category, and particularly one that needs to be medicated, right, through the use of pharmaceuticals, is both doing a disservice to normal processes of aging, and it's turning that into a sort of pathology and something that needs to be medicated. The other example that you have in this week's readings that has to do with medicalization is Zucker's article. And Zucker's writing, as you know, about a Brazilian clinic where, in fact, the providers who work in that clinic are very well versed in this concept of medicalization. They probably read some of Locke's work at some point. And they bring that understanding of medicalization and the desire to sort of resist medicalizing their patients into the clinic and how they do things there. But one of the things that Zucker points out here is that to a certain extent, they find themselves, that is the healthcare providers in the clinic, quite frustrated and unable to fully enact this project, right? Part of that is because there are limits to the degree to which they can work outside of or beyond the typical medical model in a healthcare system that is overburdened, right? As Zucker describes, the Brazilian public health care system is limited in some of its resources, overtaxed in lots of ways. And Zucker additionally points out that this notion of these healthcare providers trying to sort of overcome or resist medicalization rests to a large extent on an idealized patient, right? A patient that wants to work with them towards some other understanding of where suffering and illness come from. And indeed, many of their patients do not want that. They have also sort of incorporated a medicalized framework into their own understandings of their own experiences, right? So in other words, medicalization is not just something that is emanating from the medical establishment or from physicians and projected onto patients, but indeed patients and our very understandings of what is wrong with us and what we want from a healthcare provider is also part of that same framework. So in other words, patients often come saying, I want those pills, right? Not, gee, let's think broadly about the socio-political context of my suffering. So the providers at the clinic often find their project stymied by that resistance from their very patients. The second concept that Locke brings up that I want to unpack a little bit is what she calls local biologies. And here's a quote that I think sums up well what she means by that, okay? What she says is, the biological and the social are co-produced and dialectically reproduced. And the primary site where this engagement takes place is the subjectively experienced, socialized body. The material body cannot stand, as so often has been the case, as an entity that is black-boxed and assumed to be universal, with so much sociocultural flotsam layered over it. The material and the social are both contingent, both local. So what she means here is that even biology, right, as we understand it, is not simply universal, acultural, not informed in any way by cultural and historical trajectories. It is. And indeed, the example that she uses to demonstrate this to us is that of menopause. And she gives us some quite interesting sort of cross-cultural information about how menopause is experienced in different ways to, again, underline this idea that biology is not just a universal function of the human body, but is informed by local cultural frameworks. So the work on menopause is drawing from research that she did in collaboration with Kaufert. It was published in 2001. And what they found, doing a comparison between experiences of menopause among women in different cultural contexts, is a variety of things. But one of the key findings is that some of the sort of what are understood as the telltale key symptoms that women in the U.S. experience are not experienced in Japan, which is the comparison that they were doing. So that indeed there are both different cultural understandings and cultural attitudes about menopause and different physical experiences in those two sites. So they did a lot of work looking at reported symptoms. And some of the symptoms were simply didn't exist in one place versus the other, and others were experienced in significantly different percentages. So for example, in Japan, one of the most highly reported symptoms was shoulder stiffness, something that, again, was not part of the typical configuration of symptoms reported in the U.S. And then on the other hand, if you look at one of the key, what is understood as a key symptom of menopause in the U.S., which is hot flashes, right? That's sort of like the one that's held up often as what it means to be going through menopause. You see how different the percentage of people reporting that is between Japan and the U.S. and Canada. So 35% in the U.S., only 12% in Japan, right? So the point here then is not to say that menopause is made up or that people don't experience menopause or that menopause is somehow less real than any other condition, but to suggest that all illness categories have a component of the cultural mixed in with the biological. And that means that both how they are sort of talked about will vary, but also even how they are experienced at the level of the individual. So in other words, your body is not simply, again, a black box, a separate entity from your cultural context. How you live in your body, how you experience your body is continuous with the cultural world of which you are a part. Okay. And then the final sort of key concept from Locke that I want to pull out here is what she calls the moral economy of scientific knowledge and practice. And this, again, goes to thinking about medical systems of knowledge as not beyond culture. Instead, she says that biomedicine is shaped by values. It's not separate from our cultural worldviews, it's a part of it. And therefore, medical models are also going to carry along with them those cultural values and those cultural concepts. An example of this, which is something that we'll actually also read about later in this semester, we're going to be reading about death from the perspective of cultural anthropology later in the semester. And one of the pieces we'll read is Locke's work on the concept of brain death. And she specifically in that work compares Japanese and American definitions, medical definitions of what brain death is, and also how lay people think about or respond to brain death, quote unquote, in a loved one or a family member. And she finds two really different models, right? So again, something that we might assume would be a sort of acultural, neutral scientific concept actually is one that's supremely cultural in nature. So we'll, again, look a little bit more at that later when we get into the unit where we talk about that. Okay, so what I've talked to thus far in this lecture is key concepts, key theoretical tools in medical anthropology to sort of give you a base understanding of what this field is, and also some sort of things that you can use to talk about specific kinds of cases moving forward. So what I want to talk about for the remainder of the lecture is some of the other things that you read in this unit that are more, I think, speak to how we can apply those sort of medical anthropological perspectives and tools to contemporary health issues. So this is to suggest that medical anthropology isn't just interested in thinking about examples from other parts of the world, or examples that may not feel like they're a part of your everyday life, but that medical anthropology can be applied to the sort of contemporary health issues that we confront in the U.S. on a daily basis. So I want to give you now a couple of those examples drawn from the rest of the readings that you looked at for this unit. So, for example, you read Horton's piece, which is about healthcare in the U.S., and this is really a critique of the Affordable Care Act that was enacted some years ago, and thinking about what an anthropologist can bring to thinking about a modern healthcare system. And one of the things that Horton talks about in here is some of the assumptions that are embedded in the ACA, and why it might be important to unpack and even resist some of those assumptions, okay? So one of those assumptions is the nature of how we think about health and responsibilities for health. So there's a contrast between the notion of health as a human right versus health as something that is basically an individual responsibility. And something that the individual pursues through their consumer choices, right? So Horton wants to encourage us to think about ways to enact health as a human right and to resist this notion that health should primarily be understood as an individual responsibility in the context of our public health system. So the difference then is the responsibility, putting the responsibility for health in a particular society on the state versus on corporations, right? Or various kinds of medical institutions. The ACA, of course, was responding to the high rates of medically uninsured or underinsured people in the U.S. population. and the tremendous burden that is, both on individuals who cannot get the care that they need and on the health system in general, right, as people are simply not able to draw on resources in a way that makes sense. So what Horton is really trying to tell us here is that medical anthropologists have something distinctive to bring to discussions about U.S. health policy or national level health policies. And what are those things? One of them is that anthropologists work at the micro level, right? The ethnographic process is about working with people in their communities, in their homes, right? So being able to document social processes at that grassroots or micro level allows anthropologists a sort of bottom-up view of a system like the U.S. healthcare public health system, which is more usually addressed from the top down, right? So this is a much needed sort of complement to those more institutional kinds of analyses of something like public health. Another thing that medical anthropologists bring to this kind of discussion is unpacking or denaturalizing key concepts. Sort of in the same way that we were just talking about with Locke's idea of local biologies. One of the things that anthropologists are good at is starting with what are often taken for granted concepts, fundamental sort of elements that people have ceased to even question. And anthropologists are good at sort of actually questioning that, unpacking it, critiquing it, and often finding that there's a whole bunch of assumptions embedded in those concepts that have directed the conversation in a particular way, right? So not assuming that those key concepts need to be understood in those ways. And the other key thing that medical anthropologists can bring to a critique of public health is bringing in a sort of political economic critique, okay? That is not assuming that sort of market-based medicine, right, which is the standard in the U.S., that we need to start from that, but thinking more broadly about how politics and economics inform health and healthcare, and how we might, again, think more creatively about other ways to organize public health in the U.S. and elsewhere. Another piece that you read that I think also speaks to this question of how anthropology can be relevant to contemporary issues is Lee's piece, which is about the rise of what are called direct-to-consumer genetics. It's the services like 23andMe, for example, where you, and some of you may have done this at some point or known people who've done it, where you basically spit in a tube and send a sample of your DNA to this company and they do a genetic profile, which can tell you things about a variety of aspects, including things like your heritage, but can also give you a sort of genetic profile of your health status, right? So for example, if you have any markers that would predispose you for certain diseases, etc., right? So the rise of this direct-to-consumer genetics, Lee suggests, represents a real shift in the relationship that everyday people have to genetic research and in how we think about health and illness. And there's a few elements to this shift as she describes it. So one is a shift from people conceptualizing themselves as a patient, right, typically in relationship to a doctor, and instead now people conceptualizing themselves as consumers, right? So instead of taking your health concerns or your interest in knowing more about the genetics of your health to a physician, you buy this service from 23andMe. You stop being a patient and started being a consumer. Likewise, it's a move from something like this being considered a medical procedure to it being considered self-care, right? It's part of what you do to sort of maintain your own wellness, but it's on you, right? It's also shifting that responsibility. So from institutional control, such as the medical establishment, right, going to a clinic, seeing your doctor, going to a hospital, to individual control, and also from the medical establishment to the marketplace. So again, something that used to be a transaction or an exchange between a patient and doctor is now an exchange between a consumer and a corporation. And then this is also shifting from sort of the medical interest in protecting you from future disease to something, again, that's framed in terms of choice. Lee also talks about this shift in relationship to the deeper history of public connections to, or public understandings of, genetics research, which has changed considerably over time. So if you look at the sort of the history of genetics, and again, as it relates to the public over the last 100+ years, there are some key phases that it goes through. In the early 20th century and through World War II, we see the significance of the movement called eugenics. Some of you may have read about this in history classes and other contexts. Eugenics was an approach to the relationship between human variation and political power that was very significant, had a lot of power in, again, the first half of the 20th century. It was the sort of perspective or framework that inspired and was used by the Nazi movement in Germany. It also was very powerful here in the United States, and it was the basis for many kinds of racist thinking and policy during that era, because it took physical variation and different kinds of genetic profiles and connected them to hierarchies of social value. So a troubling sort of approach to human variation, but one that it's important to know about because of the power that it had in the first half of the 20th century. After World War II, Lee reminds us, the use of sort of genetic information or thinking about genetic variability fell under a sort of paradigm of protection, right? That is, knowing what people are predisposed to in terms of health and illness in order to plan for and work preventatively around health issues. The more recent sort of paradigm, the one that accompanies the rise of 23andMe and other of these sort of direct-to-consumer genetics products, is a paradigm of access and the right to know, right? So one of the things she's suggesting is this move to the 23andMe model is a shift of health, a shift to health as an individual responsibility, an aspect of what you are expected to know about yourself and act on by yourself, right? So it's no longer enough to, maintain your visits to your doctor's office to know about the status of your health. But now you're expected to access your genetic information to know what your status is. So this idea of putting sort of the individual consumer as the primary site of health practice is, she suggests, a new development in the last 20 years or so. And it is accompanied by new subjectivities or new ways of sort of imagining oneself and one's relationship to the rest of society and to the public health infrastructure. So now the self is understood as a project that you are in charge of, and that tools like 23andMe are at your disposal for you to manage and work on that project to the best of your ability. This is, she suggests, sort of the new cultural model of health in the era of direct-to-consumer genetics. Okay. So the final sort of piece that or set of pieces that you read that I think really speaks to medical anthropology's relevance to current issues are the excerpts from the journal Anthropology Now on COVID that I had in this unit's readings, and that you read that are on D2L. And I'm not going to discuss these in this lecture because this is part of what I want you to include in the discussion on this unit in D2L. So if you have not already, please take a look at those Anthropology Now pieces, because these are a little bit different than your typical cultural anthropology publication, right? These are deeply informed pieces, but they're a little bit more like dispatches from the field. That is, they're written by anthropologists reflecting on the very recent and current era of the COVID pandemic, and really thinking about how medical anthropology, or anthropology more generally, can provide an important vantage on thinking about the pandemic. As part of the discussion, as you'll see when you look at the discussion prompt, I want to ask you to think about medical anthropology more generally, and particularly how these Anthropology Now essays reveal what medical anthropology can, or perhaps cannot, what the limitations are as well, of contributing to our understanding of contemporary issues, including current health crises like the COVID pandemic. So I'll leave you with that thought and look forward to speaking with you soon. Bye-bye.